Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Subcontinent, a weekly show that aims to address the most significant issues in the South Asian region. And in today's episode, we'll be discussing two major issues: how American policies are distancing New Delhi from Washington, and also Russian oil finding an entry into Europe through India. So stay tuned.
In this special episode of The Subcontinent, we will discuss how American policies are distancing New Delhi from Washington. And we shall also take a look at Russian oil finding an entry into Europe through India.
The authoritative U.S. foreign policy is non-adaptive to the dynamic geopolitical trends in the contemporary world. The policing policy of America to meet its economic and security goals has now proved counterproductive for the country. Since long, the U.S. foreign policy has worked to suppress and prevent the emergence of other countries on the global scene. However, this strategy has now brought damaging results for the United States, alienating its long-term allies like Saudi Arabia, France, Brazil, and also India.
Positioning itself as greater and superior than the rest of the world, the foreign policy of the United States is being used as a tool to safeguard its global hegemony. The country has been using it to push for global alignment to meet its economic and strategic goals. In the process to secure its gains, the U.S. has been meddling in other countries' domestic affairs, subverting their governance and creating turmoil. Claiming to help the countries through humanitarian intervention, the U.S. has not been able to accept the multipolar reality of the world, where different countries are interconnected to progress in their own ways. The foreign policy establishment of the United States believes that the country is helping other nations to be on the right side of the history by following the much-hyped American values and sharing the economic approach of Washington. However, this belief is proving detrimental for the Indo-U.S. relations, alienating India, a country America has sought partnership with to restrain the growing influence of China in the region. According to foreign policy, despite a shared democratic system and weariness of China, the U.S. and India do not share a similar worldview.
India and the U.S. for decades have held divergent worldviews, pursuing conflicting objectives. The imposing behavior of the U.S. forcing India to toe its line is further distancing New Delhi from Washington. A recent survey conducted by the U.S.-based business intelligence company Morning Consult shows Indians consider the U.S. as the second greatest military threat to their country after China. It's interesting to mention that Indians also place greater blame on Washington and NATO for the Russia-Ukraine war than on the Russian President Vladimir Putin.
The U.S. belief that the geopolitical and economic tensions between New Delhi and Beijing will lead to closer ties between India and the United States has failed on the ground. There are remarkable differences between the U.S. and India on geopolitical issues and other policies. India, being one of the world's largest economies, supporting a powerful army with a thriving young population, is not ready to accept dictates from a foreign country. New Delhi has been showing that it can be forced to accept the policies of the United States on different geopolitical issues ranging from trade, climate, Russia-Ukraine war, or its relations with its neighbors. According to the result of the study conducted by a U.S.-based company, 60% Indians want their government to continue purchasing the Russian oil, thus showing their disdain against the meddling of the United States in the affairs of their country. The unwanted interference of the United States in the political and foreign affairs of India has made the Indian population perceive that Washington is unable to understand the values and policies of India, and in the process trying to damage the interests of the South Asian nation.
Now, to have more insight on this, we are joined by geopolitical analyst Mr. Syed Muhammad Ali from Islamabad. First of all, welcome to the program, sir. Now, the U.S. believes that it's leading nations towards the right side of history. So, to what extent is this arrogant thinking shaping the foreign policy of the country and proving counterproductive on the ground?
Well, the reality of international politics is this, that we are living in the last days of the post-Second World War Western world order. And when you view the US policy right now towards the world in general and the developing world in particular, you can interpret it as the US attempt to dominate and preserve the status quo by maintaining its disproportionate influence over the world institutions, policies, and countries. Although the recent changes in the world order, the rise of some countries, the revival of some countries, the resurgence of some powers has complicated the US Pax Americana agenda, which is why I think there are new opportunities emerging, new alliances being built, which is making it very difficult for the US to continue to dominate the world the way it did in the last few years.
Mr. Syed Ali, the friendship with India was an action to contain China's rise in the region. However, it seems Sino-India tensions have not helped the Indo-US relations. So what's your take on this?
I think it was somewhat naive on the part of Washington to expect India to become the pivot of the US Indo-Pacific strategy and in the containment of China project. I think the leading strategic thinkers in the US are beginning to recognize the limits of Indian security commitment towards the US interests. And I think it is also reflected in the recent US security strategy that it distinguished between alliances and partnerships. And it is very important to notice that the word used for India was not a strategic ally, but a strategic partner. And how the US explains the difference is basically ally is a country which shares not just the interests, but also the values of the US. Whereas a strategic partner like India is a country with which the US expects some common interests, but do not share the values with it.
Sir, Indians regard the US as the second largest military threat against their country. How do you view this estrangement of Indians towards the US?
I think it is a very important issue, which is often ignored in international politics, that the Indian strategic thinking is characterized by three key features. Number one, hatred towards the Muslim minorities. Number two, distrust towards the Western powers. And number three, to maintain its strategic autonomy, which means that it should not commit itself with any major power completely. So these are the three key features of the Indian strategic character. So if you see that when India tested its first nuclear weapon, which it ironically described as Smiling Buddha in 1974, it was not aimed against China, because China built its nuclear weapons more than a decade ago, and they had not any major conflict in the 70s. But it was the Indira Doctrine, which was very similar to the US Monroe Doctrine, in which the Indian strategic elite and the political leadership saw Indian Ocean as an Indian lake, which India should dominate. And it did not want any power, including the US, to restrain or constrain the Indian interests in this region. So that is something which is very interesting. And since the anti-Western perspective is quite deeply rooted in the Indian diplomatic and strategic elite, I think it is very important for the international community to not neglect the deep-rooted Indian thinking that India should be a great power in its own right, and it should not be subordinate to any other power, including its current partner, the United States.
Last but not least, sir, the U.S. is against independent-minded countries, punishing the non-adherent nations to force compliance. So do you think this flawed U.S. policy will distance India further from America?
I think it is a very important issue that the Western powers, particularly the US, narrowly interpret its values and the international system. And it is very important for peace, progress, and stability around the world and in different regions for the US to respect and tolerate and understand the diverse value systems, ideologies, political systems, and cultures of different countries and civilizations. Because if different value systems are perceived and interpreted as a threat, and efforts are made to change regimes, to change political ideologies, to interfere in the political system of different countries, then obviously this will not be seen as a favorable, mutually beneficial relationship by most countries. And you can immediately see this is the problem that the US is facing with China, with Russia, with North Korea, with Iran, with so many other countries. That the issue is not their power. The issue is their political system, their ideology and culture. And we have witnessed recently in the US attack on Afghanistan that they tried to change the culture, the religion, the ideology and way of life of Afghan people, but it did not succeed.
On that note, I would like to thank geopolitical analyst Mr. Syed Muhammad Ali from Islamabad for being on the program. Thank you, sir. Now, let's see what people around the world had to say.
David Santoro tweeted, "I've been in India for nearly a week and I'm more convinced than ever that if the US wants to advance US-Indian relations, it needs to engage India in the same way France does. That is, stop trying to rally India behind you, just focus on areas where cooperation is possible." Ivan1 wrote, "Except the US is increasingly pushing India away by pressuring them to cut off ties with Russia." Baharat Now tweeted, "India has been very clear regarding its independent foreign policy even under immense pressure from both blocs, something the US is not used to. India has chosen to serve its own national interests as a true rising power in a brave new multipolar world." Diva says, "Is the US really helping India grow its economy? We have seen no serious attempt by the US and EU to decouple from China. Only talks and lectures. I think the USA will create a conflict and run away. India is not your vassal like Japan and South Korea, where you control foreign policy."
Russia has found a new way to maintain the demand for its oil supply. Despite the recent ban on Russian oil imports, it's continuing to provide Europe with fuel via India. New Delhi has been buying cheap Russian oil and selling it to Europe at a higher price after its refinement. According to a recent report by Russian analytics firm Kepler, India has become Europe's largest supplier of refined fuels this month, while simultaneously buying record amounts of Russian crude oil.
According to the International Energy Agency, Russia is one of the world's largest oil producers and exporters. In the recent years, Europe has heavily relied on Russian oil imports, making up nearly 30% of the continent's total crude oil supply. However, since the Russian-Ukraine conflict in early 2022, the European Union imposed sanctions on Russia, which included a ban on the import of oil transported by sea. The ban was followed by an embargo on the fuel imports from the country. Nevertheless, the European Union sanctions have not prevented countries such as India from purchasing discounted Russian oil. Following the ban, Europe's reliance on Indian crude oil products has grown rapidly. According to Kepler statistics, Europe's imports of refined fuel from India is set to surge to more than 360,000 barrels per day, surpassing imports from Saudi Arabia. Victor Kitona, lead crude analyst at Kepler Energy Analysis Company, said that despite all the sanctions that have been announced, Russian oil has still found its way to Europe, and the increase in fuel exports from India to the West is a good example in this regard. He added that this scenario was inevitable given all the oil that India buys from Russia.
Russia has emerged as a major oil supplier to India for the first time in the 2023 fiscal year. According to the data provided by the Kepler company, the entry of Russian oil shipments to India is expected to surpass 2 million barrels per day, representing almost 44% of New Delhi's overall oil imports. This surge in demand for Russian oil is due to the fact that India has been buying oil at discounted rates from Moscow amid the Western sanctions on the country since the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
According to the data by the Indian Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Russia was the largest exporter of crude oil to India by value in February, in spite of the Western price cap of $60 per barrel. The price cap kept by the Western countries was designed to limit Russian oil revenues while keeping the oil itself flowing to avoid a global price shock. Crude oil imports from Russia to India stood at $3.35 billion in February, followed by Saudi Arabia at $2.30 billion and Iraq at $2.03 billion. According to a Bloomberg report, more than half of Russia's seaborne oil exports went to the European Union and G7 countries before Moscow was imposed with sanctions in the early 2022. However, since the sanctions on Russia, the scenario has changed. Presently, as per Kepler's data, India has become Europe's largest supplier of refined fuels. While the Indian supply of refined fuels has helped meet the EU's demand, its direct flow from Russia has been cut off, ultimately boosting demand for Moscow's oil barrels. This has resulted in higher transportation costs and more competition for European refineries that cannot access cheap Russian oil. This development has come amid wider market scrutiny about the region's diesel imports. This new development has not only challenged Europe's energy policy, but also demonstrated the ever-changing global oil market dynamics.
Now, to have more insight on this, we are joined by strategic expert Lieutenant General Shaukin Chauhan from India. First of all, welcome to the program, sir. Now, the energy cooperation between Russia and India is growing. What implications will it have on the global balance of power?
To talk about the global balance of power or the global energy balance of power with India buying Russian oil, we have to take a bit of a view backwards to, the first time that oil was used as a weapon in 1973. And from that time onwards, India has been aware that because she has no access to oil, we have to get and plan access to our own oil in our own way. So actually all this came to an head in 1998, when you remember that Saudi Arabia decided that she would give oil to Pakistan at lower than normal rates. And India realized that we had to do it on our own. And that's the time when we started investing in oil all over the world. And we have investments in Russia. And because of those investments, we are now have access to cheaper Russian oil. And as a result, have been able to get over this oil shock that when the oil giants raised their prices, India was able to prevent these prices being raised in India because they had access to cheaper Russian oil. So it does matter eventually, but India has been able to use this crisis to stand up on her own.
Lieutenant, in light of the increasing demand for Indian refined fuel in Europe, how do you see India's role in shaping the global oil market, and what challenges and opportunities lie ahead for the South Asian country?
Yeah, you asked about India emerging as a alternative or as a global refining power, because we have access to how this world market moves now is like this, that India has access to cheaper Russian oil. That cheaper Russian oil is brought into India and refined. We are one of the world's largest refiners of oil. I think second or third in the world. And with that ability to refine oil, India has been able to utilize this cheap Russian oil, refine it, and resell it to the European market at a higher price. And that has helped the Indian economy. As you know, the Indian population has become the largest in the world. We are a young population. We are growing very, very strongly. We need access to more money. We are developing our infrastructure. So all that requires money, and this ability of India to get this cheaper Russian oil, refine it in India, and resell it at a higher price shall certainly help the Indian economy. Along with this help to the Indian economy, since oil and economics has always been on the world stage as a geopolitical weapon, I would say this is the first time that India is realizing that we have to increase our ability, improve our economy, if we are to have a say in the geopolitics of the world.
Lieutenant, the European Union has put a ban on Russian oil imports. So how has this changed the global oil trade?
You know, I must take our mind back to the global crisis about the Europe's to the Europe's decision to ban Russian oil. So what exactly happened was that when Europe followed the American lead to ban Russian oil, she went through a crisis of the availability of oil and the availability of expensive oil for her citizens. Europe, as you know, is not a growing market anymore. Economically, she is suffering, and this Russia-Ukraine war couldn't have come at a worse time for the European economy. The Indian ability to get cheaper Russian oil came from an ability that we had made a number of excellent financial decisions to invest in the Russian oil infrastructure from 2002 onwards. And because of that, India was able to get Russian oil at almost $10 less than the rest of the world.
Last but not least, how do you see the future of energy trade between Russia, India, and Europe? And what factors are likely to shape this trade in the coming years?
That's a very interesting question about the future of the economic trade or the oil trade between India and Russia and how it is affecting Europe's economy. I feel that over the next 2 to 5 years, this will continue. The reason being that I don't think the Russian-Ukraine war is going to end. I don't think that the Americans will lift their sanctions on Russia. And as a result of it, Russia will continue to have to depend upon friends like India to pick up her oil, give her money, and also help her sell her oil to the world, her natural resource. But why do I say only 2 to 5 years? The issue is that over the next decade, the world will move away from the use of fossil fuels, especially to power their transportation. There are, as you know, great strides being taken in the batteries that are being used now to power the transportation all across the world. As the batteries become better and as they have the capability to have more power and to keep that power for a longer period of time, and they become cheaper to use than fossil fuels, the world will automatically shift to the EV kind of vehicles or to any other technology. that is available as a domestic resource.
There you have it, strategic expert Lieutenant General Shaukin Chauhan from India. Thank you for being on the program, sir. Now let's see how people have reacted on social media.
Ben Norton tweeted, "The EU sanctioned Russia and boycotted its oil, yet is still buying it indirectly from India at a higher price. This is ironically fueling both de-dollarization and inflation in the Eurozone, where workers' real wages dropped 6.5% from 2020 to 2022. S.L. Canton wrote, "Are these two facts related? India is importing record amounts of oil from Russia. India is exporting record amounts of fuel and diesel to Europe. The irrational US and EU sanctions." Norbert Elekis says, "India is importing crude from Russia and selling to Europe. Guess who's being benefited? India has now become one of the largest suppliers of refined fuel to Europe. Also imported record crude oil from Russia."
And that was our episode about the Indo-US relations and Russian oil finding its way to Europe via India. Now, to watch the previous episodes and more updates, you can follow us on social media. And when you do, don't forget to give us your feedback. We shall meet again, same time, same day, next week. So till then, take great care.